Good morning. It's April 30th, Wednesday morning. Hope you're having a good morning. The last day of April 2025. This morning I was in Job 20 through chapters 23, and the verse I wanted to share on was chapter 23, verse 12. 23, verse 12. Job here, he says, I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my portion of food. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. And I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my portion of food. Job lived before the scriptures were written. Job lived sometime in probably the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob era. He lived about 2100 years BC before Christ. So the scriptures, the Old Testament, hadn't even been compiled. The books hadn't been written yet. Moses had not been born yet. Supposedly Job is one of the oldest books we have in the world. So when Job says, I have not departed from the commandment of his lips, what's he mean? Job was a man who sought God. Job was a man who wanted to hear God. Job was a man who had conversations with God. When the enemy came before God, and the Lord said, hey, where you been? And he said, I've been traveling all over. And God said, well, did you check out my guy Job, my man Job? He's a faithful man. And he said, yeah, I've checked him out. And the only reason he's faithful is because you've been so good to him. So the Lord said, well, let's go ahead and test, let's see if that's correct. And the enemy was wrong. So the enemy attacked Job, caused many problems, lots and lots of problems. Destroyed his life at that period of time. God gave him back his life abundantly later. And of course, today he dwells with our Father eternally. And we'll get to meet Job someday, I think. But Job was a man that lived before the scriptures. So when God said that Job has been a faithful man, he was talking about a man who spent time with him. He's talking about a man who listened in his spirit. He's talking about a man who meditated on the things that God made and the animals and the bugs and the way nature was. And he allowed God to speak to him. And he called that, I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. He believed and trusted that God spoke to him with God's own mouth. Today we have the scriptures. God speaks to us in the scriptures. But like the men of old, we can also spend time with God and hear his voice in our heart. We can hear him lead us and guide us and tell us what to do and what not to do in our spirit, from spirit to spirit. And Job was that kind of man. And he says, and I have treasured these words, the words that God spoke to him. He says, they are a treasure to me. They are a treasure to me. When is the last time that maybe you heard God and thought, wow, that's a treasure? Maybe you're someone who spends time with the Lord every morning. Maybe you're a person who does not spend time with the Lord. You received him as your Savior. You go to church. You spend time with other Christians. You hear sermons and Bible studies. You pray when you need to. You pray at dinner time. You pray maybe when you go to sleep. But you're not a person that spends time with God. And truly his words have not become a treasure to you, or you would seek those words. You'd want to hear those words. Job here, he says, I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my portion of food, more than what's on my plate. All of us show up for mealtime, unless someone's fasting. They show up for mealtime. We, as Americans, we spend, I don't even know how much money people spend on food nationwide. I've never read it, but we spend a lot of money on food. We complain about the price of groceries. People complain about the price that it costs to go to a restaurant, but we keep doing it. How many of us treasure the food on our plate more than the words of God himself? It's my prayer. As we'll become a people like God, like Job, that can say, I treasure the very words that he speaks to me. Usually a treasure you go seek. Usually a treasure you have to go find it. You look for it. God is all around us. Paul said that. He's all around us. We have our being in him. We live in him. And he desires to speak to us. He desires to speak to us in his scriptures. But even in his scriptures, it's the Holy Spirit that has to speak to us through the scriptures. Or else we become like the Pharisees, where Jesus said, oh, you know the scriptures, you just don't know me. That's my prayer, is we'll become a people that treasure God, that depend upon God, that cannot live without hearing God's voice speak to us. Thanks for listening to me today.